without further ado, I hand it over to Dr. Maryam Nouri-Aiin. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kathy, for inviting me. So as Kathy said, I've been working on this worms for the past almost now 8 years, and I'm a postdoc right now, and I'm still working on these worms. With that, I'm going to talk about a little about what the species we have, their life cycle, how to ID them, what are the concerns about these worms, and the management. There are some submitted questions. I'm going to go through those, and hopefully, if we have extra times, we can go through other questions if there will be any. I'm sure it will be. So these worms usually in literature, scientific literatures are referred as jumping worms, but they have so many other common names, including snake worms, crazy snake worms, and few more. We have 3 species of them in Northeast and also in Minnesota and these regions. They are they're called Amentis agrestis, Amentis tokyoensis, and Metaphyra gandorfi. This map is from 2020, but they might have been spread even more. Like right now, we have a lot of reports that they are in Canada, like actually just right across the border from Maine, most of them. And I think, yes. So they have 3 different life stages. First, the most probably important and kind of highly ignored is cocoons. They are in cocoon form almost all year round. A lot of them, they start to hatch in March, but still there's going to be a lot of unhatched cocoons through the year, like in April, May, June. They are round, and as you can see for all the 3 species, they look exactly the same. The only difference is they are variable in size. The juveniles of jumping worms, they look exactly similar to other earthworms. They don't have any reproductive organs yet, and reproductive organs are the features that you could identify earthworms based on those. So they are almost impossible to ID by their morphological features. You can extract the DNA and ID them by molecular methods, though. So that's how we do it. But for like people in the field, it's really tough to ID them based on their morphology. They're usually on top of the soil in March, April, May. They're usually in the leaf litter on top of the soil when they hatch. And then as they consume the leaf litter and the leaf litter dries out, they go to topsoil. They don't really go too deep. So they're usually on top. The adults, you will start to see the adults usually probably 2 years ago, it was end of July, you would see the first adults, but this year, because it was so warm, in my garden, I saw the first adult. I think it was end of June, so it was almost a month earlier. But in the woods, there is still, I think, right now, they're starting to become adults. The highest abundance of the adults are in like end of August, early September, end of the year. In November, December, they just die naturally. Like there is no way for those worms to have another life cycle. It's only like few months. And based on our previous study, it was a field experiment. So it's not like we had a worm and we counted exactly how many cocoons they produce. We went to the field, we collected the soil, extracted the cocoons, and then counted the numbers of the worms in that area. And based on that, we calculated that each worm on average produces 60 cocoons in a year when they are adult. It may not be super accurate, but it's relative. And the adults usually are on top of the soil too, just like juveniles, but they go a little deeper, maybe an inch or two. So this graph is really important if you want to manage them, because when you manage any species, you want to do it when the population is at high peak, so you don't have to keep reapplying. For example, if you want to control juveniles, if you apply your treatments, whatever, hand picking, whatever it is, that means you have to keep doing it because they're hatching. But when it's the peak of juveniles, that's a good time. You can target way more if you do it on peak. So for the juveniles, the peak is usually early June. It might change depending on temperature, but right now it's mid-June to June with this temperature we had this year. For adults, peak temperature is peak abundance is early September. It might be 1 week earlier this year. In the gardens, in the woods, it's usually same. And so, yeah, the most important thing about this graph to remember is mid-June to early June and mid-August to early September. How to ID them? So the three species, they look exactly the same, but they are very different in size. Amentis tocuensis is the smallest one, and it's the skinny compared to the other one. Agrestis is the medium size, and Hilgendorfer is the biggest one. This picture, you can see like it seems a little lighter, but it's not. It's just a bad picture that I took. It's underneath. It's the ventral part of the worms. So the top is usually like it looks a little more brownish sunburn compared to the belly side of it. So how you can ID them is mostly by this clitellum. The clitellum for these worms, it goes all around their body. There is no gap. Like for other earthworms, there would be a gap underneath, like there would be a little gap in the clitellum. But for these worms, it's always perfectly rounded. Sometimes it's a little, what's the word for it? It's not super level with the rest of the body. Sometimes it is, so that won't be the best indication. But here, so these worms are the worms that are reported on iNaturalist as jumping worms. So here you might be able to notice the difference. On the left-hand side, you can see the species that are reported correctly as amentis or jumping worms. And on the left, actually right side, these are different species that are reported as jumping worms, but they are not jumping worms. Like, for example, this one, look at the tail, it's flat. Like jumping worms, they don't have a flat tail. And the shape or the clitellum here is very pinkish. The color is obvious, like, or this one is very pink. And if you actually turn these worms around, you would see that the clitellum is not all around their body. But look at jumping worms. They're usually very bright, milky color, and it's perfectly round. I think this presentation is going to be available to you. So I provided this, there's a link here that goes to an identification key of other species of earthworms. I think they call them common earthworms. So whatever is there, that means if you find a worm that looks like those, that's not a jumping worm. That's how you could use that. What are the problems with these worms? So they've been reported from gardens, nurseries, barns, forests. but they're not recognized as pests in gardens, nurseries, and farms. But in the forest, they do create a lot of problems that they are recognized as pests in different few, I think, states they are um, mm, like considered as forest pests. In the garden, what they could do to your garden is they change the soil physical properties. They make the topsoil very loose. Also at nurseries and farms, the same. With nurseries, if they get into the pots, they might just induce drought symptoms. So the soil might dry out very quickly, and the casting is very loose. So from the drainage holes, sometimes you can see all of the soil just comes out. So why they're not a big problem compared to the forest in the garden and nurseries farms? Because we keep adding compost, mulch, or just improving the soil. So we really don't have that huge problem that forests are facing with these worms. In the forest, the soil becomes very loose, so it's really easy to erode, and like with heavy rain, it just washes off. Um, they consume the leaf litter, which are habitat and food to other species, macro or microorganisms. And also there are some seeds that they really rely on that leaf litter layer to germinate and succeed. If that layer is gone, they would not. Um, so that's the biggest issue that they have in the forests. And that's why we should not spread them to the forests. They may not be a huge problem in the gardens, but still, like most of the places that we're working in, all of the spreading sites are wherever the forest edge is next to a garden or human activity. When you go to the center of that wooded area, you see less and less worms. It's always us introducing them. So that's why we want to just reduce the numbers that we introduce to the forest. It's you don't see the pictures, right? I don't know why it's not showing my pictures. Well, I had a picture here. It's not there anymore. So if you don't have the worms in your property, you can prevent bringing them in. Horticultural materials are the main source of their dispersal, including plants, soil, mulch, compost. So if you don't have the worms in your property, just make sure where you buy your material, it doesn't have worms. If you are a nursery and you might have worms in your nursery, in your product, just let people know that you might have worms. So if they don't have the worms, they won't introduce them to their properties. The other way is to propagate plants from like seeds, cuttings, or like if you buy plants, you could bare root them. It may not be the easiest way, but it's an option. Cleaning a station always works, especially if you are next to the woods and you want to walk to the woods or something. You can just have like a wood brushes station or just like a cleaning a station. So if you go to the woods, you don't take the cocoons, earthworm cocoons with you. You can power wash your equipment in between. If they are worms, you can see them usually, but if the cocoons, they are really easy to spread. So power wash would work. And also, like if this is for if you have the worms in your property and you want to dispose your composting materials or something, and you can't really do it in your own property, just talk to a composting facility or something, and because they raise their temperatures really high, which kills the cocoons if they take those materials. So, and if you have the worms, and it's almost impossible to eradicate them. You can't really get rid of your worms unless you kill everything else too. So what you should do, just monitor them, make sure if you are trying to manage them, keep an eye to see if your management strategy is working. So keep monitoring. They are very patchy, uh, just a spot to a spot, and also year to year. Like 1 year, you might have hundreds of them per square meter. Another year, you might have only one or none per square meter. So keep an eye on your population. If you are worried about plants that they may not, so far in all of the experiments I've ran here with different plants, I haven't had any plant that are susceptible to the worms. They grow fine. But I've heard from other people that they did like a small research on this worms, unpublished data, that plants that they have shallow roots, they might be more susceptible, which makes sense because um, shallow roots means they are really depending on that topsoil structure, which changes with worm presence. So that could be the problem. So if you have the worms and your plants with shallow roots, they have problem, maybe try plants with deeper roots or just experiment with those. And also, if you have them, do not transfer horticultural material from your property. If you transfer plants, bare root them or use cutting, especially if you send them to a place that they don't have worms. And also adaptation, it's not gonna solve the problem. We don't know, like right now, we know that they really don't destroy the gardens, but in a very long period of time, we don't know that. They might have some detrimental effect on the gardens, but so far, no evidence for that. Okay, to management. Chemical control, it's a no-no for these worms. There is no approved pesticide for jumping worms, and it's basically illegal to use any pesticide or any chemical to control worms. I'm going to go through a few different management strategies. Some of them, at least to me, they do not seem viable. And then at the end, I get to the one that to me seems more practical and effective. So one of them that is very, I think almost everyone asks about, mustard flush. This method, it brings the worms to the surface. It doesn't kill them. At the end, you have to hand pick them. It doesn't kill the cocoons. It's very expensive if you're going to use it for a large area. And some people, they might be very allergic to mustard. And it smells really bad. The other problem is these worms that we have, they actually usually live on top of the soil. They really don't go deep in the soil. Mustard flush is for night crawler and those species that really dig deep into the soil, and there's no way to hand pick them. So it's not recommended for the swarms. The other one is methods that they're not experimented on the swarms, and they might be effective or they may not. So no guarantee, I'm just presenting them. One of them is tilling. Tilling might be, if it is effective, it will be effective against juveniles and adults because it could just disturb their habitat. It may not kill them. If you want to use tilling, best time is when you have the highest peak, which is like June or early, like late August, early September. And yeah, I mentioned that it's not effective against cocoons. Mulch and organic materials. So we know that like worms, wherever you have mulch and worms, the worms are the happiest. Mulch provides the moisture, humidity that they need, and also it might be the microbial activity there that the worms feed on them, and it makes them super happy. So not adding mulch and organic material, it might help to reduce their population, or at least make them less fit, so they don't produce as many cocoons as they would if they are really healthy and fit. Also, it's something that you may not really see the results immediately. It might take a while to see any drop in the number of the worms. So if you want to try it, you could. There's no harm. The only thing is you have to avoid adding mulch to the gardens or beds. One of the best ways to control these worms is actually solarization. You could do leaf litter, mulch, compost, soil, which by that I mean if they are in a bag or you can move those materials. And also you could, I should have had this as like solarization. And the other one is to solarize topsoil. If you do have like leaf litter, mulch, or compost or soil that you want to solarize, you could, in the next slide, I'll talk about like how properly set up the solarization. But you need to make sure that they are the heat gets into every single corner of your pile. Leaf litter is very effective if you could collect them in May or like March, April, May. That's when they start to hatch and they leave there. If you can collect them at that time, just bag them. And later on, when the temperature rises and it's hot enough, you can solarize those bags. Or if you can solarize them, maybe talking to a composting facility, maybe they would take those and take care of them. Also, if you do the leaf litter, you could, most of the cocoons are on top of the soil, the top 1 to 2 inches of the soil. So you could even collect that area and solarize that too, bag those. Of course, it's really tough to do that for a large area, but at least like since they are super patchy, maybe you can find the patches that are, they have a really high abundance, and just do this practice in those areas. For soil solarization, you could just cover the topsoil with clear plastic shield, and temperature usually goes higher than 104, which is necessary to kill the cocoons and also the worms for at least 2 hours, and which it happens if you cover the topsoil in a sunny day. Probably in June it would happen. But the problem with this method is you would kill the worm, the cocoons that are on top of soil where it reaches that temperature, but it doesn't kill the worms because they escape to the cooler area or the surrounding area. But still, it's effective if you want to reduce the cocoon population. So if you have a bed or a garden that is heavily infested and you really want to just manage the population, this is one approach to take. So for solarization, you have to it's really important to remember the pile should not be too deep, because that the center and like in depth, it never reaches 204 degree. You need at least 2 hours of 104-degree Fahrenheit, evenly distributed everywhere in the pile. You need insulation materials underneath, a cardboard, and then with a tarp over it and your plastic cover, put your pile and then cover it with plastic. It's a lot of work, but if there is any contact with soil and if you don't make that insulation layers, that means the bottom there is no way to get that bottom to that temperature necessary to kill the worm. So all of the cocoons on top, of course, they die because they can't move, but the worms, they go deeper. So it's the insulation part is a really important part, and also make sure to seal the edges properly because they could get out, especially if they are adult. And manual removal is another method. I had a picture here too. It's gone. So another method to use is to remove them just by hand, which is probably the best and one of the most, like, it's very environmentally friendly to just hand pick them rather than do anything else, mustard or even solarization, anything else. When you weed the garden, I don't know, some of you might have noticed, whenever you weed, they start to come out of the soil, especially if they are adult, they're much easier to notice. And this is natural because the earthworms, they do not like vibration. It makes them come out of the soil. So when you do weeding, you can have a bucket for the worms too, a weed bucket and a worm bucket, through the worms in the other bucket. So one way is you collect the worms, you can just throw them in water. They would die in maybe 10 hours or overnight, or even if you want to keep them longer, 24 hours, they would die in water. And then you can just put them back in your compost pile, or even throw them back in the garden. The other way is, like other earthworms, they're casting and their body is full of nutrients. So you could have a bin with maybe drainage hole, some screens for airflow, and through the worms in there, add some leaf litter, whatever you want in it, and just let them live their life until the end of the season. They would decompose, like break down all those materials for you. End of the season, which will be November, December, if they survive until then, they would die naturally. There might be cocoons in the bin later, but you could then solarize those materials and then add it as an amendment to your soil or to your compost. Or if you don't want to deal with that, you can just drop it at the compost facility if they take that. I had an example of setting up a bin here, but maybe at the end of the presentation, I can go out of presenter mode. It might show up again. But that's an approach. So there are few things that are always questions, and they're very important to remember. One, are they good for vermicomposting? No, because they have a short life cycle. They don't compare to vermicomposting earthworms. So most of the year you won't have any worms to process your composting material for you. And also they might outcompete your real earthworms that are in your compost, red wigglers, which are the normal composting earthworms. And also there is a risk that they're going to spread around. Some of the measures that we talked about, as I mentioned, they are specific to a species, and most of them have been used, including mustard flush and tilling. They've been used in the sport fields, including golf courses. But they haven't been tested on jumping worms. So that's why those methods, we're not sure if they are really effective on worms or not. They need to be tested on those worms too. And we are working on few new approaches here. And also we have colleagues all around the country, they are working too. So it's basically research in progress, but nothing for sure. And also it's important to remember there is no magic bullet. We all might need to do a few different approaches. Hand picking is probably the best one. solarizing highly infested area is a good method. And then the other methods, like just don't transfer material, or like those are mostly cultural approach that we usually take to not to introduce them. If you are taking any control measures, just remember to always monitor, keep an eye on that treated area with, I don't know, hand picking or solarization. So you might solarize a bed, and the surrounding area, there are worms. If you have, like, in a while, you actually need to keep an eye on that bed. And when the worms from the other side, they start to migrate into that uninfested area, maybe you can just handpick them. So you don't have to go through another solarization method, but you might need to. So it seems like it will be an ongoing battle. It keeps going on. Like there is almost no way to completely eradicate them when they are in an area. And also their cocoons, they survive at least for 2 years in the soil if they don't hatch. So you might get rid of the cocoons or worms 1 year, but like 2 years later, one worm might hatch, and they are parthenogenesis. So one worm could start a new population. And also it's important to remember, like whatever method you use, which life stage it is, because like you don't want to do something that, like, there are few approaches that are more effective on juveniles. Like even if you do solarization would kill juveniles much faster than it kills adults. So it's important to adjust whenever it's needed. Like if you have adults, maybe you need to solarize for a little longer. Okay, and sometimes like you don't see the results immediately. It might take a while, so don't be disappointed immediately. Okay, we got to the questions. Please be sure to cover any control measures that are sustainable, not non-chemical. So the chemicals, we said, like there is no chemical control. And non-chemical solarization, hand picking are probably the best. Do plastic pots from other present a problem with the spreading jumping worms? The pots themselves, no. I think this question, I couldn't tell if they meant like soil in the pots or not. If they meant like there's soil in the pot, yes, there might be worms in them. But if it's only the plastic pot, it can be rinsed and reused. The worms are obvious, but if you have like cocoons, cocoons are tiny, so they might just stick to the walls or something, which is usually unlikely. But because they dry out very quickly. If you have a cocoon that sticks to a wall of a pot, they might dry out completely. They could rehydrate. They might come back to life depending on how long they were dried out, but it's very unlikely. So it's it's basically safe, but to be very safe, just rinse the pot, I would say. Is solarizing, next question, solarizing raised bed worse if there are a lot of jumping worms in the surrounding grass or in general area? And does it like kill the soil microbiome? It's so the thing is, yes, there is like, of course, the worms, as I think this person knew that, like they're gonna come back to that treated area, but the goal is to reduce their population, to just keep them under control. So, like if you walk in your garden, if the probability of transferring like let's say if you have like 100 worms per square meter, the probability of transferring cocoons is, let's say, like with each step you transfer 5 cocoons. But if you have like 5 worms in 1 square meter, the probability of transferring cocoons, they might just reduce to 1 cocoon per step or 0. So if we keep the numbers under control, it's good. Like it's always recommended. So I think that would be a good approach to, even if you have them in the surrounding area, um, solarize the bed if you are, especially if you are close to the woods. If not, it would be just extra work and maybe not much results. And what does it do to soil microbiome? Uh, I haven't done any experiment with solarizing and microbiome, but there are other studies. It seems like, according to my brief literature review, in a short period of time, solarization it has a really high significant impact on soil microbiome, because microbes, some of them are very sensitive to heat. So it would change the soil microbiome. Um, but if you have like compost, you can reintroduce some good microbes into the soil, right? You could inoculate it with, um, um, what is it? There is some vermicompost tea. That's one method that could be used, or even just like maybe handful of compost you could use and re-inoculate your soil. How destructive are jumping worms to a straw mulch perennial bed and removing them manually? Yes. So they are, they're not really destructive to perennial beds usually. Maybe on seedlings, or if a plant starts from seed, there might have some effects, maybe. I can't really say that for sure. But a straw mulch might provide a good shelter for them, like a lot of microbial activity, a lot of moisture for them. So they might be happier and healthier in the straw mulch if you have that. And then next part of the question is removing them from top 4-inch. Yes, it will be an effective management. Still, if you can manually remove them, it would be great. And it's probably the best approach, honestly, to take for this worms. It's just not everyone wants to deal with hand picking them, but it's the best approach, to be honest. I found jumping worms in my compost bin in my backyard, and I'm worried about how I can do composting going forward, especially if I have ground cover bin, ground contact bin, and rotating. Is it possible to use mustard powder and water or solarize? Solarization, yes, definitely. That one works. But mustard powder, I'm not sure. In a pile, if you do it in a pile, they might start to escape from the sides. And also it doesn't kill them. They might just come, like some of them might come to the surface, and also it doesn't kill the cocoons. So it's not the best approach. But solarization, definitely, if you do the process properly, it should work. Is it safe to bring pine bark mulch from outside sources? They might have jumping worms eggs. What about wood mulch or straw hay? Is there any safe way to bring compost from outside without potential for jumping worms eggs? It's usually like when you buy all of these horticultural materials, if there is a middle sale person and they store, like mulch or compost in an area, that's how usually the worms are introduced to those piles. But if you buy them maybe from the main source, whoever produces them, there is just a lower chance that they might be infested by worms or their cocoons. For compost, depending on how compost facilities themselves they store their materials, but usually compost facilities, because they have to raise the temperature really, really high, it's very unlikely to be like infested by jumping worms. So compost, if you buy it from the main source, whoever produces them, there's a high chance to, and they also rotate it. They're not like a compost bin and a house that it's like a small area and they could escape. So from the main production source, that's probably the higher chance. A straw or hay, because they're so dried, I don't think those have the potential to transfer earthworms, cocoons, or themselves. It's usually mulch, soil, topsoil, compost material that have the higher chance. Next question is, what vegetable plants can best tolerate jumping worms? So far, it seems like most vegetables are okay with jumping worms. Maybe if there is something with shallow roots, I can't speak really on that because I'm not sure. But I have tried like cilantro, onion, chive, scallion, mostly from allium family in one experiment, and they were completely fine with worms. And also in my garden, I don't see much effect on vegetables. But if there is a vegetable that has a very, very shallow root, then those might be affected. Next question, how do I prevent jumping worms migrating into my woods from my local community garden? Also, are they any creatures that preys on jumping worms? So how you could prevent them is all those approaches, like make sure not to introduce them, or if you have them, it's important to, especially if it's a community garden and it's next to woods, like not to dispose the garden material in that spot without cleaning them, without solarizing them, without hand picking the worms. It's usually actually like around nurseries where the worms are in the woods. It's next to their compost pile because they dump all of their materials in that area and then they start to spread everywhere. So where you dispose the garden material is really important. Just try to hand pick them. If you can solarize, especially the topsoil, like early in the season, it might be effective in a community garden. Yeah, I think it's different approaches. It's not only one. Are there anything that they prey on? Nothing to be super effective. Maybe a few worms, but nothing that could control their population. I've seen robins eating them, but there are people that they say, oh, I threw them at the robins and they don't even eat them. Excuse me. So yeah, nothing that could really effectively prey on them. How deep in soil worms and worm cocoons are, and can they be solarized? The cocoons are usually on like top, I think 2 to 3 inches on topsoil. So with solarization, if you solarize topsoil, it should work. But again, topsoil, it's not effective on the worms themselves. And someone asked a question about what soil testing is happening around the state right now for commercially available soil, and who are the best resources to contact with the question. And Kathy said we have a state horticulturist here that maybe they can help us to answer this question, because I honestly don't know that. And
Yeah,
soil test, I don't think there is any commercially available soil test available for jumping worms too. So I don't think that the first part of the question is probably, at least in Vermont, no. And the second one, yeah, then we can.
let me see if I
Well,
can ask Gary to unmute. Oh, there he is. Okay, great.
yeah, I mean, if basically there are no testings going on for this, if we have a report that a composting facility has delivered something that has jumping worms in it, I work together with the Department of Environmental Protection, Mark King, and we may go visit those facilities and see if we can find jumping worms. So far at commercial composters, we've never found them. At some of the municipal composting facilities, we have found them. And, you know, basically, if they can truly compost, it's going to kill the worms and the cocoons. The problem is then they store it in a place that is not protected. And then that pile gets reinfested. And so there is no guarantee for any place that you might get materials from that they are going to be jumping worm free. And I don't expect that that's ever going to be a process that will be happening at the state level. There just aren't the resources to do something like that. We do have BMPs, best management practices, that we have been promoting with composters or other facilities that are working with soil materials to help them understand that if they do compost, then they need to be storing that in areas that are protected from worms, and that may help reduce the potential. But even then, there's still a likely worms are going to find that food because that's what they love, and it's going to be hard to stop that.
Thank you. We did get another question in the chat earlier on. Last year we had so many worms in the garden. This person was asking about what accounts for the population variability. So some years maybe are really good years and maybe some years not so good.
So it might be their biology, or it might be environmental impacts. Like some years, like let's say we go through a very short, even a short drought period, that might impact them. And we don't exactly know how the biology of these worms actually works. So maybe, like, let's say they go through some environmental stress and they just stay dormant until next year. The other hypothesis that might be, I don't know, might be valid or not, is one year you see a really, really huge population and they exhaust the resources. And then next year, there's not much food for them actually to have or to survive. So not many of them are there. And then because there's no food, basically. We don't, there are just a bunch of hypotheses. No straight and direct answer to that.
Okay, some other questions. Will the worms be in wood chip paths? And will the worms migrate across a wood chip path?
Yes and yes. Yes, they love wood chip, yes. And especially if it's moisted. If it's dried, no. If it's moisted, yes. And they do move around too. Yes.
Okay, and then another, I think that the 104 degree Fahrenheit requirement for solarization maybe used to be for 3 days was required, and now you just said 2 hours. So has some more work been done in that area?
Yes. So before it was based on a research that I think they didn't really measure the time intervals. It was like they incubated the cocoons or worms in 40 or 45 degree Celsius, and they looked at them after a week or a few days, something like that. But now it's actually, hopefully it will be published or at least submitted. We're working on writing it. I just ran an experiment and incubated the cocoons at different timing, like in 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, hour 30. And so actually 90 minutes seem to kill them all. But just to be sure, let's say 2 hours. And for worms themselves, it was even shorter.
Great. And then how thick or deep can the soil be for best solarization?
That's a great question. I think it's usually actually how many 30 centimeter, how many inches is that? I need to convert that.
I think that's about a foot, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah, almost. Yeah, that would do if you have the insulation in the bottom, that would do it. But deeper than that, no guarantee. But the shallower it is, the better it would work.
Okay. And then I think that's all. Oh, wait, one more. If there were a square meter infested with worms, would they increase their area around that square meter? And if so, how far?
Yes. Uh, yes, they move a lot. So that's for sure. How far they move, or even if they move, I think it depends on the food sources in the surrounding area. Humidity, like not human moisture, soil moisture level, food, and shelter. I would say they love to go under like tree trunks or wherever is sheltered a little bit. So yes, they do move. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it. I had one question, one odd question, because you answered it when we spoke earlier
Mhm.
on, but I was curious about how many eggs they lay and how that all works. Could you just let everybody know how the egg or cocoon laying happens, and so they can strategize their management practices accordingly?
Yeah, sure. So they don't produce any cocoon until they are adult, which is when you see the clitellum around their body, the whitish ring. After that, how many they produce, as I said, we don't exactly know. It's just the average that we got from the field experiments, almost 60 cocoons per worm for each year during their like one annual life cycle. And how they produce the cocoons is the cocoon forms on their clitellum, and it has so we haven't seen this for jumping worms. This is for other earthworms, so that's why we assume. So during summer, you might see some worms with a crack on their clitellum. It's like a crack. It looks open. Um, that's when they produce cocoons. It's about to or after producing the cocoons that you can see the crack. I think the cocoon forms around the clitoris and it just goes around their body until it detaches from the head. And after that, I assume it hardens when it's in soil. So I think there is a video on YouTube, but not for jumping worms, for other earthworms, if you are very curious about like how the cocoon production process is.
So I think you said that they about produce one cocoon a week. Is that right? Like since
Oh,
they
in
are
that,
mature through like when they die in November, let's say.
oh, that was your, sorry, I
Mm,
completely went the wrong way. It's, I think every day and a half is one cocoon
okay,
for adult worms. Yeah. So
that's a
if
lot.
you calculate that, then it would be like almost 60 cocoons in, let's say they are adult from early August to mid or late October. That would be like 60 cocoons per adult.
Okay, thanks. So a couple other little questions here. Would sand be a good barrier?
Um, then if it has moisture, they can just get around it. Like it won't be too, it might be irritating to them if it's very dry, but if it's moisted, I don't think they don't, they move, like they get away from it. Yeah, not that they would live in it.
Okay, great. And then Gary Fish put the website where you can report that you have jumping worms in the
Yes.
chat. So people who think they might have them or have them and have not reported them, it would probably be good to just use that form and submit that to the state so we can have better records on where the worms are and aren't. Well,
Yeah,
mostly just where they are, I guess.
yeah, that's a really good point because so iNaturalist is one of them. IMAP is, so iNaturalist is something that almost everyone uses. Like it's very general. IMAP is, I think if I'm not wrong, IMAP is the one for invasive species. So if you record them or report them on IMAP, it's a little easier for people that work on this invasive species to just collect the data to, and also whenever you report, picture is really a good clear picture is very important.
Yeah, if
Well,
you
it looks like,
report on the state report form, we post it on IMAP for you because IMAP can be challenging for some people, but the survey 123 form that we have you can go to is really simple, easy to upload a photo, and then as long as you give us permission, then we will put it on IMAP for you. And
That's
that
all.
is a system that we use in Maine is IMAP.
great, thank
That's
you.
great.
So it looks like we're about out of time. I think we got to all the questions. I'd just like to let everybody know that we are going to be having another Zoom talk in November 6th at 7 p.m. Dr. Lee Freilich, who has been working on jumping worms for quite a while at the University of Minnesota, is going to give a talk that evening on with some of the preliminary results from his summer field studies. So that should be pretty interesting too. And okay, so we have a plant sale coming up and some other things. If you want to hear more about or be alerted to things going on at the Native Gardens of Blue Hill, just sign up to go to our website, sign up to be on our mailing list, and you will get very well every other week we send out an email probably, so it's not you don't get a ton of mail, but you'll be able to find out what's going on. Okay, so I'd love to thank you, Maryam, for this wonderful talk and for really all the great images too were really helpful to see the worms in different situations, and I think very helpful. So I hope everybody gets out there and checks out their garden and looks for worms and then reports what they find to the state. So thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and good luck with the worms.
Thank you.
Thank
Right.
you.
Thanks, everybody.